Okay, welcome back to our final Nurturing Communities Network conversation. We've had some really great times together and discussed some important topics that affect all of our communities and that affect this country and other countries around the world. We've been blessed to have a really stable core of people who have been consistent, and then others who have kind of come and gone. So a lot of good conversation partners. We've been wrestling last week and then again this week with communication and thinking about life-giving communication specifically. We began with an introductory video, and in that video we discussed that communication is more than just an exchange of information, but it's the way that we share ourselves with each other. It's the way we get what's inside outside. We also we're reminded that communication is the way we think about creation, that God makes the world by speaking it into existence. And in fact, sometimes we even call God the Word. That's how much we value communication. And this is a word which brings life. And that's why we value life-giving communication. Now, one reason we have gathered in our respective communities or desire to gather into community is a recognition that we're not very good at this and that it's difficult and requires a lot of hard work. And so we gather together in order to learn to communicate or perhaps to relearn it. We recognize that we sometimes speak in ways that are harmful, in ways that bring death instead of life. We recognize that we speak in ways that are untruthful, and we deceive others and sometimes even ourselves. And we also recognize that in our communication, very often we withhold that most important gift of all, which is ourself. And we don't share it with others, perhaps because of fear, because of the risks that are entailed. And in holding back, we miss out on something. We have less of the life that we've been promised. So we gather in community in order to learn to do better, in order to draw that life out in community with one another. We want our speech to bring life, like God's creative word brought life there in the beginning. So last week we had a panel who shared with us from their own experiences, learning to communicate within community. We really focused on what that looks like internally. And this week we're going to think about how our internal formation can be a gift to the world and how we can witness good life-giving communication for the sake of others. But just briefly to review, and then I'll actually ask you some of your thoughts on last week. Some of the things that I heard was from Claire Stober from the Bruderhof. She emphasized the need for good listening as part of communication. It's not just speaking. She emphasized the importance of transparency, of meaning what we say. And she also talked about over communicating, that it's better to say too much than not enough. We had Chris Smith with us from Inglewood Christian Church. And Chris reminded us that in any communication, there are power dynamics. It's always a social relationship. And so we have to be aware of, where power lies. What is the hierarchy here, and to not let that interfere with our communication. Andrew Howard from Genesis up in Minneapolis, he spoke very well about the need to communicate well in times of change and transition. Of course, our lives are characterized by change, and life within community is marked by all sorts of changes. So on the micro level, of the daily word to the macro level of celebrations and rituals, it's really important to wrap those changes with good communication. And then finally, Laura Lossmetter from the Common Home Farm in Indiana, she gave us some specific tools to communicate well. shared with us some of their own practices, like the circle way. She talked about the talking stick. And in the video, we were also reminded of skills around nonviolent communication, which has been, I think, very essential in many of our communities. So those are a few things I heard in the big conversation, but I'd like to open up some space for you to share some things that you heard, either in the big conversation or in your own breakout conversations. So we're going to take just a few minutes now and open it up, and please feel free to share.
I'll jump in real quick. Something that really stood out to me was Claire from the Bruderhof community sharing how important not gossiping is, and just how central that is to kind of stuff when gossip is happening, and how to, and not, it really worked at not doing that. And it came up again in discussion here at Jubilee in a book discussion group we had the following Monday, in processing that. So that was helpful.
Thanks, Sarah.
I can also jump in. I was really touched by what Laura from the, I think from Japuza, had shared about really taking time to access our best selves and like create intentional spaces. She shared an example of just taking 15 minutes for an opening prompt, like almost like an icebreaker before community meetings where decisions would be made or important conversations would happen, as a way to just kind of enter the space together. And that's something even just this past week we've used in our community. And then later in our breakout room, really appreciated something that Joe Gatlin shared about just recognizing that, like, in our conversations, God is with us as well. And God gives us that boldness to step out and be vulnerable with each other, the strength to be, to just start the conversation and see where it leads, which is always really good encouragement in the effort to over communicate rather than under communicate. So thanks for sharing all last week.
Thanks, Joe.
Alden, I guess for myself, one thing that really stood out, and what a number of people said, was the importance of transparency and honesty, and in times of conflict, that we need to speak to that. It occurred to me too, we also need to be able to articulate our fears and name our fears. And on the other hand, as you were pointing out, the importance of words in creating reality is to be able to really speak words of hope and affirmation, and basically proclaim the gospel, and that both of those things, there's sort of some tension there at times, but both are so important to Christian community, I think.
I'm really sorry that I missed last week, but hearing about over-communication makes me think of a wonderful Emily Dickinson quote. "We must be careful what we say. No bird resumes its egg." So you can't go back and take back what you say.
Thanks, Elizabeth. David Burleson, you posted something in the chat. Would you like to just share it or read your chat?
Yeah, something my dad always reminded me of is that the desire to be right is what destroys unity. And if we hold on to our opinion or the right to have our opinion over others, it divides us and we can't come together. So we discussed that in our little breakout last week.
I like that you used the word humility. I think that really helpful thing to hang that idea on.
Alden, two things that struck me last week. Claire's observation that our communication skills ideally are learned in the home, and that that's really where we begin to develop our instincts for listening well, being seen and heard, and communicating well, which is great for those who've had an amazing, incredibly competent family. But I think for most of us, that's not entirely true. And so I think the other thing that was really encouraging to me along those lines is Chris's observation that, even very incompetent communicators, folks who have never really had the space or the time or maybe even the imagination for deep communication, can learn it over time with practice. And the story of his own community becoming skilled as communicators over a period of decades. So maybe setting the expectations realistically, this is going to take time. But even if we weren't well formed as communicators in our families of origin, God has provided for us a community with whom to learn to become good, deep, careful, and loving communicators.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That reminds me of a story from our own community experience. Like many communities, we wrote a rule very early, and the rule served us well. In fact, we changed very little, even year after year of reaffirming it. But after visiting other communities, and especially spending time with the Bruderhof, I think we came to see more and more the importance of good speech and good communication. And so really the most significant change we made to our covenant was in about year 8. And we put in a section on speech and communication. I think we just took it for granted or assumed that was something easy, but coming to see that as a discipline that required intentionality and commitment and needed to be covenanted, to me at least, was a sign that we were growing, but it wasn't something we thought of at the beginning. So even though communication and speech seems like a really basic idea, I think for many of us, it's something we have a deepening understanding of as we mature.
I also heard the reminder to realize that the person or the people we're speaking with are people we love. And that kind of sets the paradigm for how we want to speak to each other. Again, I have the chat stuff in front of me right here. And, much of what you've already shared is something that was shared in the chats over and over. The need for intentionality, which Alden, you've just spoken to again. And that's part of the reason for having resources that we will put up later, Alden will speak of. But because we know, personally and collectively that this is a long journey, and we need to keep at it. We can't just do 2 workshops and know how to do this. So yeah, it's been that whole thing of starting conversations with gratitude or affirmation. Here in Hope Fellowship, our members' meetings typically start with a time of affirmation, something we learned from Church of the Sojourners in San Francisco. So that's another blessing of this time, is the cross-pollination that we can share with each other from different experiences.
something we talked about in our breakout group was the importance of playing together and building trust and building that sense of we can go into hard places together when we have that background of having fun and getting to know each other in a playful way too. And that seems really simple, or something that could easily just be taken for granted or forgotten, but that was something that came up.
Well, as we think about why we are focused on communication as a discipline within our communities, of course, there's recognition that there's some healing that happens here, that we need to be better at communication, that we'll have a fuller life, a more abundant life through better communication. But we also recognize that we don't engage or undertake these disciplines for our own sake alone, but we are learning to communicate and to give life for the sake of the world. And our communities exist not only for our own sake, but for the redemption of the world. We've joined God in God's own mission to speak healing and redemption. And so what our conversation will focus on today is, well, as Kent framed it last week, in a dark and tasteless world, how can we be salt and light? And these are Jesus's words from the Sermon on the Mount. Now, it's this kind of an abstract idea, how that our speech and our communication can be somehow good or salvific for the world. So one way that I've been thinking about it concretely, and Claire mentioned that good communication starts with the family. So she helps us bring that back down to whatever table we're sitting at. But for many of us, we'll be sitting around a table in a couple of weeks, and it won't just be with our beloved community who's covenanted to communicate in life-giving ways. It'll be, with Uncle Larry or whoever, and we will have opportunities to practice some of these good communication skills at our Thanksgiving dinners. So I don't think so much that as a community, the world just looks at a little bubble and says, that's the group of people communicating well, but it's often as each of us goes out into the world and maybe back into our home communities or our home family, biological families, that we have those opportunities to be transparent to God's Spirit, to not get in God's way with our own speech and our own fallen forms of communication. And we know that maybe more than other Thanksgivings, this is a particularly divisive time in the nation. Many of you have been keeping up. Some of you probably have not been intentionally keeping up, but there's a lot of divisive speech in our nation, in this nation, I should say. There's a lot of untruthful speech in this nation. There's a lot of hurting people in this nation. And so, if you're here in the United States, and other countries, I think probably have their own struggles, we know that this is a time more than ever when we have to model this, when we have to demonstrate it, not in a self-righteous way, but in a way that shows just how life-giving it can be. So as we move into these conversations, of course, we're free to range broadly because we have a 45-minute block here. But I do encourage you to think specifically, okay, how can I or how can we be salt and light in the world? And the goal of the conversation, in addition to practicing communication and getting to know each other, the goal is for each group to distill some specific recommendations. Concretely, this is what it means to communicate well for the sake of the world. And we're going to gather up those at the end of the conversation, and Nancy and Debbie and some others of us, we will boil them down, and we will put this up as a community resource, because the Nurturing Communities Network at its heart is about seeking wisdom communally and discerning how best to go about these difficult tasks that we've been called to. So, Debbie, I think if it's okay, we'll go ahead and break out into these groups. Again, we have 45 minutes for these sessions. Make sure that you introduce yourselves if you don't already know each other, where you're from. Find someone who's willing to take notes for the conversation, and try to come up with some specific ways in which we can communicate in life-giving ways. So after the conversation is over, when we get called back, the note taker will paste those notes into the chat, and that way we'll have a record of those notes. And if you forget what you're supposed to be talking about, Debbie's going to send a little reminder of what the question is, and also when we should be moving along. So she's going to help facilitate these group conversations. And then we'll come back together and chat just a little bit more about what we heard in our groups. So if that sounds okay, we'll go ahead and break out. Welcome back. I think we're all repopulating the main group. So we're just going to open it up for a few minutes. We actually have a little bit of time here to hear from your groups, and I would encourage you to share something you heard, which is a good communication skill. Whether in the general conversation, or we can talk about some specific recommendations that you formulated.
I heard Evan Howard share just the idea of our call to model life-giving communication in the different spheres that we might live in outside of our own communities. That's a very powerful thing.
Unmute, David.
Yeah, okay. I was moved by the experience that Amo from the Bruderhof shared with us, because he and his wife, I guess, or have been sort of freed to live off the Hof in Farmington and to engage with their neighbors in all kinds of ways that sort of open up. Something that's not possible if you're staying sort of in the quarantine bubble of the community. And that is, has opened up a lot of opportunities and also some frustrations, but it seemed like a very creative way of engaging in the community, in the conversations outside of community life. And he was kind of pondering, you know, when do you be relational and when do you be prophetic? And we talked with that a little bit.
I was thankful to get some input on the things we are experiencing, and thank you, David, for your input on trying to listen and then rephrase somebody with another opinion to yours, to be able to say it so that they agree. Yeah, that's why I'm saying, and to work on that skill. Basically, I know I have a ways to go, but to at least then the person feels understood, and then you can maybe move forward.
Well, I know one thing we talked about in our group was how do you deal with relationships that become estranged, and the tension that can put on communication. You know, if someone doesn't want to talk to you, how do you communicate? You know, and then also if they do begin to want to talk to you, where do you start? You know, how do you re-engage? We didn't have any particular answers, but it did kind of, you know, get us thinking about both, I think, the image of God in each other, and we're always trying to recognize and remember that, recognizing validating pain and having support in communication, remembering we need community for ourselves, you know, places, maybe a way I would put it is we need spaces where we don't have to think about how much we have to over communicate or whatever. Like, it's really important to be personal about those things. We need some spaces where the emotional energy that takes, we can kind of, for a minute, and maybe ask others to help or at least take a break. And then we talked about just our limitations, I guess, as like embodied beings. You know, we can't be in tight-knit 100% relationships with everyone. Even Jesus had, you know, a group of 3, a group of 12, a group of 72. He had his family, but then he redefined family as well. And I guess kind of holding the values, the ethics that Christ gives us of connection, being called to peace, this multi-ethnic community that we see in Revelation, as well as the fact that we are called to peace and to be peacemakers here. And we kind of, that means maybe one of the ways that we're violent with our communication sometimes is trying to force things whenever they don't need to be, you know. And so being okay following spirit and trying to recognize the tension that might create sometimes.
Thanks, Jeremiah.
Barbara and David both spoke well in our group just about reminding us when we find ourselves operating from a space of against or anti this or that, or kind of comparing ourselves too much with, you know, that church down the street, like we're not like them, or that we just need to be attentive to getting swept up in waves of negativity, and that we can say, no, this is what we're for, not what we're against.
I don't know if this topic came up in other conversations, but social media was broached, and Evan gave a pretty helpful metaphor of thinking about our social media space as a living room and helping us to use that image to think about what would I want to say to these people were they gathered in my living room, and kind of invoking hospitality, I think. And that was a helpful image to think about it. We also wrestled with, should we be on there or not? And is this a time for good people to speak well? Or is it, you know, is it still such a treacherous place that we should perhaps avoid it at the peril of our own soul? So I don't know, did that question come up in anyone else's conversation?
It didn't come up in ours, but I will, and it's good advice, I think, very much. Also, some good counsel was from Roberto, particularly about thinking of conflicts between Christians, between Christian groups and so forth, which he's experienced there in Saltillo, is to remember that we're part of the same family, to focus on that, and then to continue to work just on for all external relationships to grow in humility and love, and pointing out that in our families and in our communities, there's the sort of excellent ground for us to grow in humility and love just through our interactions with each other.
in our group, we talked about the different communication styles within personalities and also culturally, and that it's really important to keep that in mind. And Lonnie was in our group, shared a personality resource, like a tool for understanding personalities that I hadn't heard of yet, called People Colors. And she said it's been really helpful. So that I'm gonna look into that.
The chat notes is really, really helpful, by the way. Those of you who took notes and put things in there, kudos to you. Very, very well done.
Well, Lonnie, that's a good transition, I think, for us, because we do want to encourage you to not only look at these chat notes, but also to visit the Nurturing Communities website. And we will be posting, gleanings from these conversations, as well as some other sorts of resources, some books. We'll point people to some of the things that have been mentioned, maybe the colors, personality test, some resources on nonviolent communication and circle way, things like that. And we want to remind you that this is the beginning of a conversation. This is a seed, and we hope that you'll bring this back into your own community and that you'll continue that conversation about how to communicate in life-giving ways. Consider doing some sort of study of one of these books, as has already been mentioned. Think about how your community is going to be intentional in its internal discipline of how are we working to form ourselves as good communicators. And think about how you are connected to the world and how your community will be salt and light. And one thing I'm taking away from this conversation is it's very different for all of us because we are linked up to our local and transnational communities in a variety of ways. We're gifted in a variety of ways. Evan's on Facebook and I'm not, so that's an avenue he has that I don't. So within our communities, let's really think about how we're going to do that, especially in a time when, again, the national temperature in the US is so high. How will the people of God bring peace, make peace, specifically through our communication? Let me open it up if anyone has a final word. Actually, I think Joe may have some concluding thoughts for us as we wrap up this whole series of conversations and maybe look ahead a little bit.
Sure. Let me say, let me just mention a few things as our time runs out. And then I think some of us are prepared to stick around on the call and keep the line open for another half hour if anybody just wants to visit some. So feel free to stay, but feel free to leave. So I'll share a couple of things and close us with a prayer. One thing, Alden mentioned the website. Would encourage you as you look at the website, if you've not looked at it, there is a map of participating communities and the Nurturing Communities Network. And there's also a link there to what's sort of required to be a participating community. And basically the basic thing is to self-affirm as a Christ-centered community. We've really worked on not trying to define nurturing communities as a particular doctrinal persuasion or one certain part of the church, but that we're Christ-centered and that somehow we're related and participating, which everybody on this call is. So, you know, the map can help. I mean, helps some folks. I've talked, and others of us have talked with a number of new little communities out there or people looking for a community. It's helpful to say, well, you know, we do have this map. And so if your community's not on there and you sort of look at that and think, well, that does fit us, well, then let me know, let us know, and we'll add you to that map, and really always looking for ways to get people more engaged. This, as Alden also mentioned early in the call, this wraps up this fall series, and I think all of us involved have really appreciated it. The spring series was well. I think we've made lemonade out of our lemons in terms of COVID. Had to cancel some events, but we've really had more participation, I think, from across the country and Canada and Mexico and Costa Rica at one point with different communities, and new communities have continued to crop up and get formed. So it's actually been a good way. I mean, we'll look forward to someday when we can have regional meetings and maybe another national gathering, but that's not coming soon. So we are thinking about 2021, as we come into that, thinking that maybe a fruitful way to sort of continue this tradition would be to have a series of roundtables, which would be a little more informal than these workshops that we've done, but we'd try to target some specific interest, just maybe like how, raising children in a communal household, or communities involved in
I recognize that as one of his daughter's phone calls, Gabriella's ring.
And it was actually, she was calling Nancy, and our computers are hooked up in a way her phone rings on my computer. I can't explain that, but anyway, now she's, sorry, I'll get rid of that eventually. So just some different ideas, communities involved in affordable housing. We're going to send out a survey. It'd take like 2 or 3 minutes to respond to it, but really want to try to see what sort of topics people are interested in. If you would say, yeah, I'd love to see a roundtable on this, or some other idea you've got, then we can try to organize some of those. We'd also welcome anybody, and there'll be an opportunity for this. If you want to help do some of the organization, that would be great. I'll point out again, none of us in nurturing communities are paid for doing the work of nurturing communities. I mean, this is just an all volunteer effort. But some of us do have some time, and so that's sort of my closing thing is, if you're there, you want to reach out to us or seek other communities that might be facing the same issues you're facing, or stumped or whatever, feel free to send us an email, reach out to us with a call. We can spend some time on the phone. Often we can point towards other communities that maybe are similarly situated, dealing with the same sort of issues. So that's what it means to be a network. We're hitting 11:30, so let me close this time with the call and with a prayer, and we'll say goodbye. And those that want to stick around and visit some more, that would be great. So, Lord, we do thank you for this time together we've had today. Pray that you will help continue to bring us along in communication with people in our families, with brothers and sisters in our churches, around the Thanksgiving table. Help us to know how to bridge gaps with the political polarization that there is in the United States and other countries too. Help us to be able to build those bridges to people that are very different than us. We desire to be salt and light in the world. Help us to be even yet a little saltier, and even light up our light more brightly. We do thank you for your grace and your love, and fill us with your peace. In Jesus' name, amen. So good to be with everybody. Peace of Christ.
Thanks all.
Bye.